Hi, I'm Ann Rieselbach, Program Director of the Architectural League, and welcome to the second set of presentations by the League's 2024 Emerging Voices. As always, to begin with some thank yous. This series is made possible through the generosity of the program's sponsors. On behalf of the League, I would like to sincerely thank the series' longtime supporters, Elise Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown. We were all deeply saddened by Jeffrey's recent passing and will profoundly miss his enthusiastic presence at this and so many other League events. Additional support for the Emerging Voices program is provided by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council and by the Next Generation Fund of the Architectural League, supported by a group of past Emerging Voices and League Prize winners. Architectural League programs are also supported, in part, by public funds from the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, as well as by members of the Architectural League. Please consider joining the League. You can find membership information on our website, and it will probably come up in the chat, too, as a link. The Emerging Voices program was launched over 40 years ago during the League's 1981 centennial celebration, renewing an ongoing commitment to recognize, nurture, and share the work of young and emerging architects and designers. Through an invited portfolio competition, each year a jury comprised of a small group of past Emerging Voices, alongside a combination of curators, journalists, and educators, selects 8 practices based in the United States, Canada, or Mexico. The 2024 award spotlights individuals and firms whose work addresses pressing contemporary issues, from climate change and resource extraction to social inequities and exploitive labor practices, with, following the long-standing tenet of the series, a distinct voice that has the potential to influence the disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, and urban design. The jury reviews portfolios from candidates who have a significant body of realized work, while also considering their accomplishments within the design and academic communities, as well as in the public realm. To learn more about past and recent winners and their work, including lecture videos and interviews, please check out the League's website. This year, the jury examined truly accomplished examples of work that represented the breadth and new directions of contemporary architecture practice during the 2-step process of selecting this year's winners. First, evaluating work and design statements from about 50 firms to create a short list of candidates, and then reviewing more extensive portfolios from about 20 finalists in the process of selecting 8 emerging voices. We are grateful for the time, experience, expertise, and enthusiasm of the 2024 jury, Paula Aguirre, Behnaz Assadi, Fernanda Canales, Irene Chang, Mario Gooden, Brian Lee Jr., Jess Myers, Marie Law Adams, and David Godshall, who will moderate today's program. David is a co-founder and principal of Terremoto, a 26-person landscape architecture studio with offices in Los Angeles and San Francisco. Terremoto, a 2023 Emerging Voice, won the 2021 Lanzine International Landscape Award and has been featured in Architectural Digest AD 100. David will introduce each firm, and after their presentations, we'll follow up with a conversation with the speakers. He will also pass along questions from the audience, which you should post in the Q&A section, not the chat section. And please also watch for information about CEUs, which will appear in the chat towards the end of the presentations. Thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward to the lectures.
Hi, thank you, Anne, and I'm excited to be here and have the opportunity to moderate this conversation between Katherine Darnstadt and David Hill. So as I prepared kind of this introduction, I kept being drawn back towards context and region because I think it's so interesting how both of these practices engage with context in sometimes similar ways and in ways that are also sometimes quite different. Well, I don't think it's a novel idea to talk about design's relationship to context. I think any good design is inherently contextual. I do hope that this conversation might powerfully illuminate the minutiae or like subgenres within context or region. Contextual conditions that often inform design can broadly be divided into 2 categories. One type of contextual design is like the physical aspects. Geography, topography, sun, wind, rain. Is a place where you're building arid? Is it temperate? Is it near the ocean? The other kind of defining contextual conditions of a project are cultural. Is it rural versus urban, populous versus scarcely populated? Is the place in which we're designing wealthy, of average economic means, or low income? It is within this tornado of context that designers find themselves working. The physical and cultural contexts within which Latent and HILLWORKS find themselves working are kind of fascinatingly totally different and also quite similar in many ways. They are opposites in that HILLWORKS mostly works on land and on projects in more rural, remote, kind of land-rich, agricultural, post-agricultural settings. Sometimes in a way that feels more intimate and for a smaller audience. Latent, on the other hand, tends to work in kind of more dense urban metropolitan areas in and around Chicago. That being said, both practices endeavor to serve communities and landscapes that are often overlooked. Both practices examine and embrace fully the physical and cultural conditions in which they find themselves working and attempt to create positive change, whether that change be creating resources for a community in need or making land that was once fallow useful again. And before I kind of get into the introductions, I also want to talk briefly about time, because I think both of these practices have an interesting relationship to time. HILLWORKS works with nature, and so that their context is always evolving, and the changing of the seasons perhaps guide them and provide a rhythm. They work iteratively and additively, as we'll see in David's discussion about the Alabama Meadow research plots. With Latent, what was so profoundly interesting is that they've, in part, on certain projects, they've focused on working in particular neighborhoods and streets in Chicago for years upon years, which means kind of interestingly, they are active agents of change within the context in which the city that they work. And I imagine, Katherine, that there's a great responsibility and joy in recognizing this. And that's part of the reason I'm so excited to speak with you today. So that's my introduction. And I'm going to kind of jump into the slightly more basic introductions of both of the people whom are now speaking. We'll be speaking with Katherine Darnstadt, who is, I'll start with HILLWORKS. HILLWORKS was founded by David Hill in 2009, and it's located in Auburn, Alabama. I've shamelessly stolen a little bit of text from both of your websites and describing you guys because I feel like it's useful, and though it's cheating, it's important to sometimes hold people to task. Located in Auburn, Alabama, HILLWORKS is grounded in the ecological and cultural complexities of the Southeast. We revel in the spirit of craft, thrift, and resourcefulness that permeates this region. So I'm so excited to speak with you, David, in part because of the exuberance with which your practice celebrates and explores the landscape vernacular of a region that sometimes the landscape architecture, the design profession in general, problematically jumps over. And much like Latent, HILLWORKS skillfully jumps between scales and typologies, and their penchant and resolve for deeply studying existing conditions and figuring out how to get maximum impact while sometimes intervening as little as possible is a necessary and inspiring framework of theirs. And I'm thankful to get to hear more about it today. Your work has an urgency and an elegant frugality to it that I'm excited to hear about, in that, even per my last sentence, I believe we need to be championing kind of modesty and austerity, because though sometimes the means and ways that we work in our present day need to become more minimal, the impact needs to be just as big. And this is fertile new territory, I think, for the design professions in general. And now to Katherine. Latent was established in 2010, and I love the simplicity and clarity of the sentence. Was established in 2010 with a commitment to equitable community development. I'm complimenting you, Katherine. You wrote that sentence. It was founded to explore the influence of architecture as small or as large as the context allows. And I'll stop plagiarizing from your website. So over the past 14 years, Latent has built a diverse and robust body of work. At the larger urban design scale, they've done fascinating framework plans for the Department of Planning and Development, the city of Chicago, exploring the potential of a rails and trails greenway belt. I loved learning more about that project. Very jealous. That seems like a dream project. At the smaller scale, I'll skip over the medium scale for brevity's sake, because I want to turn the floor over to you guys and hear it from you. But at the smaller scale, and the disclaimer is my favorite scale is the small scale. Whenever I start to investigate or learn about an office, my business partner and I have always been like, go to their smallest projects, because you can't hide anything like in the small projects. And so I love learning about the recently completed ADU that you built in 2023. Which was based on the Come Home Chicago competition entry that you did. And I just found it to be modest, intelligent, inquisitive, and so nicely detailed and appropriate to the context, the budget needs, and the budget and the client needs. And I think the present media apparatus of architecture and landscape architecture sometimes does us a disservice. And I acknowledge that the Architectural League of New York is an exception to this, which is why I'm excited to be on this panel. But in that we still sometimes the biggest, loudest, glitziest projects are championed. And so I feel like we just as a community and culture need to figure out ways of making space for championing modesty. Lastly, I just wanted to express that my admiration for Latent, excuse me, and that it seems that you are unafraid to take on projects that might, from the outside, seem almost impossible. And through thoughtful design, you kind of empower the communities that you serve. So I'll mute myself now and take the video off, and I'll turn the floor over to you guys. And so I'm so excited to hear both of you present, and I have some questions when we're all done. So take it away.
I'll start sharing my screen. All right. Well, hopefully everyone can see this. First of all, I just want to start by saying thank you to the league and to the jury for this incredible invitation. We're really honored, downright delighted to be here, be a part of this discussion. Allow me to begin by saying HILLWORKS, we are a small practice, and I work with some pretty amazing people. So before I get into the work, I want to just talk a bit about, the fantastic people that we get to work with. So Sadie Gherkin-Chitty, Rachel Hamrick Perez, Elizabeth Hill, they're fantastic colleagues. You'll see their thumbprints and fingerprints all over this work, as you will people that have moved on to other practices: Kelly Holman, Will Nix, Amanda Ferran, Debbie Koo, Alejandro Ramos, and countless other visitors and interns into HILLWORKS. I just want to say thank you from the beginning to that crowd that's done so well for us. As David mentioned, we're located in Auburn, Alabama. We needed to put that on the map because not many people know where that's at. We're grounded, as he said, to plagiarize from our own website, we're grounded in the ecological and cultural complexities of the Southeast. This place, the Southeast, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, it's rich in ecological diversity and even richer in cultural histories. And our work is trying to respond and work within this context of craft, thrift, and resourcefulness. Should also mention, you can see on the side here that we are really, we're put in a pretty good position to benefit from the rich interaction of academia and practice. So I've been at Auburn University in the landscape architecture program for almost 15 years now. I really love working with the people in that program. Huge plug to that program. It's the best in the nation. I'm not biased at all. But I will say that, that you'll see in the projects that our practice starts to push a bit on research, and research starts to push quite a bit on practice. And it's quite fluid between the body of work between practice and academia. And we really are fortunate for that relationship. And finally, before we jump into the first slide, I just want to note I really appreciate the emerging aspect of this emerging voice. We may be more, it's maybe better characterized by saying we're finding our voice. I think when we started the practice in around 2009, 2010, we were fascinated by adaptive reuse and inventive reuse and surgical insertions and material recycling. And over the years, our body of work has shifted more and more to a fascination with plants. And so today I'm going to talk more about plants and about our engagement with plants. And that's been a shift over our short lifespan. So simply put, plants are fascinating. Over and over, we find ourselves in awe of plants. We're in awe of spaces they create. We're in awe of how they grow. We're in awe of how they reproduce, how they compete with other plants, and how they change the atmospheric conditions around them. We're fascinated by immersive experiences, and we're blown away by how thick and deep existing plant and human relationships are, especially in this region where plants grow so fast and where the growing season is quite long. Well, we believe that plants are inroads for larger discussions about the environment, habitat health, and ecological systems. And our work attempts to build on these cultural associations and experiment with novel relationships between plants and humans. I should mention that landscape architects, I believe in my short time that I've found some pretty large vulnerabilities in our discipline, or at least in my own experience of our discipline, and that we're not, as a discipline, very well suited to understand plants in a very intimate and relational way. Our discipline focuses a good bit on installation and not a lot on manipulation or longer term relationships. So this idea of time that David mentioned is really important in our work. And what I've done today is tried to assemble 4 projects that each learn from other disciplines who also are dealing with plants, but they are dealing with plants in a much more long-term, a much more nuanced way than we often do when we focus on just the design and implementation of a project. So ultimately, we hope our work starts to build this, cultivate this love and interest and curiosity about plants, this fascination, and we want to build that spirit of wonder around the natural world. So we're going to talk about lessons from gardeners, lessons from foresters, farmers, and engineers. 4 projects in our time. So first, the gravel garden. The gravel garden is, if we categorize, and I acknowledge that these are oversimplifications of a lot of disciplines and a lot of nuance, but there still are pretty incredible lessons from these disciplines. All right. Gardening is one of the lineages of our discipline in landscape architecture. We learn quite a bit about land manipulation, holding power, about building a relationship of a site over time. And we learn quite a bit about understanding a place through the experiences of a body. So gardeners remind us that plants change through the seasons. And so this diagram to the right starts to explore the different transparencies, the different colors, and the different textures of plants through the seasons. And this gravel garden is essentially a study in the phenology of a place, and a study in how that phenology can expand into more spatial, more exaggerated spatial conditions. So as with many gardens, we started with the ground. The soil, this site was a former parking lot, so the soil is compacted and heavily compressed with very little nutrient. So we started the process by reworking that soil so that it has capacity to grow. It is a living environment again. And then we added the gravel on top so that anywhere in the garden in this particular space can be both walked upon and grown in. So this kind of intermediate surface. And then over that entire terrace, the gravel space, we've laid a 14-inch grid, and we've calibrated that 14 inches really carefully to be about the body as you can move in and around and among plants. So this 14 inches is kind of a bit of a was our first experiment of how wide does that need to be to provide density with opacity through the seasons. So you'll see there are rooms carved out of this grid, there's paths carved out of this grid, there's spaces within the grid, but in general we put this grid of 14 inches across the gravel and then put annual seeds of zinnias, cosmos, basil, Queen Anne's lace, sunflower, species that were typically annual cut flower kind of species at the base of each of these posts. So literally the garden begins as quite open and transparent and more about the surface of the ground. And then through the seasons, the species start to grow up and enclose and entangle and kind of create more opacity. So here we are in May. You can start to begin seeing some of the form of the plants, the tall, skinny ones starting to lift, and the ones that are more horizontal starting to spread. And we're really fascinated by the space that's starting to be generated by these species. June, plants are already, you can see the zinnias already starting to flower, the sunflower starting to flower. You can see how the sunflowers outpaced the zinnias, and the zinnias are kind of responding to the shade of the sunflowers, but the sunflowers taking up the majority of that solar energy. And then in July, when the entanglement is probably its highest peak, when the leaves are the most dense, each of these rooms are quite distinct from one another. And the opacity is at its highest. In this kind of the high end of the summer, you see that the flowers serve as a bit of confetti dancing around with the long stems holding the flowers fairly far away from the leaves. It became this fantastic kind of dancing in even a subtle breeze. And then the season started to turn, and really we're fascinated by how each of these plants had a different timeline of going to seed and of dropping their leaves. So you can see the bright chartreuses turning to grays and browns, and the seed heads becoming more prominent and more the chocolates of the seed heads and the grays of the seed heads being really prominent in the garden. And then finally we pulled it all up and started over the next year. So again, we're learning from the gardener. How do we think about this landscape through time? How do we sit in a landscape and observe plants and observe how plants respond? Second project is Lessons from Farming. It's a transformation garden. We're going to shift scales a little bit. This is on Auburn, Alabama's campus, on Auburn University's campus in Auburn, Alabama. Auburn is a land-grant institution. From its inception, it has a mission. At the core of its mission is learning about agricultural practices and disseminating that knowledge into the general public. Its goal is to get that knowledge out. You can see from this map in 1892 that there's a pretty fantastic ratio of land to building. There's quite a bit of laboratory space out in the field. Students are out in the field quite a bit, and there's just a few classroom buildings scattered within the campus. Even though we're in the middle of a pretty dense agricultural region, our campus has shifted to quite a bit more dense through the years, and it shifted our model from being a landscape laboratory, more to kind of leisure space and park-like space, as have many, many, many campuses around the nation. But we were called to participate in this project to try to help the university design what they're calling a transformation garden, trying to get as many of these land-based research plots from kind of scattered around the fringes of campus into one particular garden that can start to build off of itself and collaborate with other disciplines. And so you can see this, it's about a 16-acre garden. And one of our first tasks were to try to do an assessment of what kind of research was already happening in the fringes of the campus and could they fit in this 16-acre zone. So without getting too far into the planning, I want to just briefly describe, we're trying to take the operations of the agronomist and the operations of the orchardist and the operations of the horticulturalist and try to fit those into this space and build space and infrastructure for that to also be a classroom and a landscape of learning and demonstration for the general public. So each of these disciplines and each of these interests, these research interests, had a team to advocate for that particular for that use, and we're essentially trying to build a place where students and visitors and faculty can fully experience change through time and fully experience how this place is cultivated over time. So to shift away from the planning phase a little bit, just like most farms, this garden can't be implemented all at once and all overnight. So we're approximately between phases 2 and 3 in this diagram, but we're trying to build the landscapes that we have resources for, that we have energy for, that we have space for, and allow it to grow into eventually a more full and dense situation. You see some of the in this aerial, some of the layers of the proposal with overlaid the existing. At the core of the project is this idea that it's going to remain public and accessible. So you see that one of the first moves that was made is this larger path system, pedestrian bicycle path system that goes right through the heart as a spine through all of the plots. And you'll see some of the plots that we're really loving the grain that's starting to form in this patchwork quilt kind of approach. We also love the proximity of these crops right up against the campus buildings. And I would love for these crops to continue to creep into the campus and replace more turf. And we love the immersive experiences that are already available here. Layered on top of that phasing, just like the agronomists that we're working with, the soil is the backbone of the success of this garden. And so while we're waiting on the development of the project and the design of the project to be fully refined and funding to be found, we're trying to regenerate these soils through time. And this is something that Auburn has quite a lot to say about. Professor Duger in 1896 started what we now call the old rotation. The old rotation is 13 small plots that have been planted every year for the last 130-ish years. And plots 1, 6, and 13 don't have any rotation in them, but the rest have a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year rotation. And it's constantly proving that, and this is now common knowledge, that rotation matters, that the cotton that's planted with no rotation continues to have a fairly low yield. You can see this chart, that's the black X's at the bottom. And then the kind of yellow circles are the yield of all the crops that have a rotation. So simply put, rotation matters, we can continue to build these soils with rotating cover crops through. So we borrowed from those practices and tried to implement those in places where we're waiting on funding. So the orchard, the children's garden, the places that require a bit more infrastructure and future funding. So here's Dr. Delaney on a tractor, distributing, with a seed drill, distributing seeds. And so you can see here in this image some of the small plots starting to emerge, and where there's no plots emerging, there's cover crops trying to build that soil. Really fascinated by this as a technique, as an operation. We're also fascinated by this as a spatial experience. It's created, it's brought a scale to the campus that you often don't see, and a texture with this particular cover crop is the winter, this cereal rye. And even with a subtle breeze, this is creating some pretty fantastic textures that move across the site. In the summer, they planted, this past summer, they planted sun hemp, which was just a wild pollinator attractor. And the sun hemp grew 6 to 7 feet tall and created these pretty fantastic moments moving through this larger landscape. So again, we're trying to find opportunities and structures to get away from this installation-centric focus of our practice and into a larger, more rich and thick series of manipulations. Third project we're looking at is in, DeKalb County, Alabama. This is the north side of the state. There's an emergency call center. DeKalb County is one of the places, like so many places in Alabama, that face concern of tornadoes and really strong winds and storms. And so there was a need for an emergency 911 call center to cover that fairly large region. So we were asked it's a fairly rural space and a rural site. You can see the farms, fields, and forests all around it, and chicken houses all around it. But we were asked to participate in the design of the project. The building is a fairly small building on a fairly large lot, and convention down here, as is in many places, is to push a lot of the shrubs up against the building as foundation planting and have these large expanse of lawn. And so our initial strategy was just to invert that and try to build as large of a native meadow as we could and push the lawn up against the edge of the building. So you can see in this image, number one, the east meadow is one that we wanted to retain. We're proposing to retain as a meadow in the future, while the number 8, which is a larger meadow, we would encourage that to become forests and essentially try to accelerate succession on that. You see the lawn right at the base of the building with this mow strip. We designed this mow strip to be very, very clear about where the mower, no matter the season, where the mower should work and where it shouldn't. And it was a really easy, clear framing. So the really got excited about the scale of this meadow and the textures, all the phenology that we were exploring and enjoying out of the phenology project started to show up here as well. Spatial qualities, the competition of these species. These are all perennials instead of annuals, but very similar in competition and growth and expansion. And we realized fairly quickly that the installation was one thing. Management of this space was a completely much more difficult issue to work with. So pretty quickly, in the first 3 years, we realized that we had a significant Johnson grass invasion. And Johnson grass is a very, very aggressive invasive species in Alabama. And so the pink on the left, Johnson grass, the yellow are, this is just kind of drone collection of these species, but the yellow is the black-eyed Susan, which is part of our mix. You can see very clearly the delineation between area that has been disturbed with heavily graded and area that wasn't heavily graded. There was Johnson grass in the seed bank that didn't start to emerge until we implemented the project. And so this limitation really caught us off guard. We started trying to figure out strategies for working on this landscape. Again, very hands-on. We're not landscape contractors, but we try to get out in the field quite a bit to understand what's going on and to try different scenarios. So I have to say this work has continued to evolve, and it's transitioned to a research project with Emily Knox near Auburn's campus to better understand how we can manage these landscapes. So I won't talk much about this. Is the Mary Olive Thomas demonstration for us. I won't talk a lot. I see I'm running out of time really quickly, so I won't talk a lot about this particular project, but we're continuing to try to work with foresters to understand how they have managed the land over time. I'm going to get to some of these fire images. Dr. John Cush has been incredibly helpful to teach us that that fire is a tool that has nuance, and there's a craft and a care to dropping fire in a landscape. He's taught us quite a bit how that fire can be manipulated to the way you drop the fire manipulates the speed and the temperature of it as it moves through the landscape. So we've been doing quite a bit of work, and this work is both between 911 and what we call MOT, Mary Olive Thomas, the Alabama Meadows. We're again trying to figure out how do we take these operations at the scale of a forestry unit and apply them at these much smaller scales and in ways that other people can participate in. So I have to pause and talk about these drawings by Hannah Keltner, really fantastic drawings that look at how the plants, this is plants before the fire, the native species before the fire, right after the fire, and the following summer. And we don't want our students at Auburn to have 30 or 40 species that they're repeating in every project, but we're trying to cultivate this sense of curiosity about plants so that they can carry that into their practices. All right, the final project that I'll talk about is lessons from engineering, and this is the Advanced Structural Engineering Lab right here on Auburn's campus. It's a really large building that is investigating the kind of yield and deflection rate, structural capacity of large structural members, mostly with the Department of Transportation. And so when we're invited to the project, so a large roof surface was adding quite a bit of impermeability to the site. And so the first move by the engineers were to build a pretty significant size detention pond. And so we were distributing those detention facilities into these smaller stormwater basins. And so you can see there's 4 stormwater basins here, what we call the Auburn basins. What we're learning from the engineers is that there's some function that needs to happen in these landscapes. We're trying to get these basins to hold water for only 24 to 36 hours to keep the peak off of the streams. But we were trying to also focus on filtering and creating these incredible habitats. So you'll see what we did is we put the plants right at the base where even in a 1-inch small storm, you would get that interface between the water and the plant root system. And one basin was planted with a collection of wax myrtle, you see here. The side slopes are these gravel, larger gravel rubble, and the bottom is this much finer gravel. But planted one with wax myrtle, one with winterberry, and this one with chokecherry. And they get flooded up to 4 feet, and the plants get fully inundated, and then within 24 to 36 hours, the water goes down. And we've been really fascinated by how the plants just seem to love this and take it on. And you can see the wax myrtle is grown about 3 or 4 times in size and becoming a screen to the boneyard and the parking, but continues to get inundated. And we're really excited about the chokecherry basin, that suddenly volunteers of aster and goldenrod and boneset have emerged in this basin, and we're working now with the engineering department to study what species have volunteered and to try to build a dialogue around these not being seen so quickly as weeds, but seen as adaptable, resilient species that have, kind of show the punk side of the landscape. So I'll stop there. I'm going a little long here. I just look forward to any questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, David, for sharing that incredible amount of work. And I think, as the other David mentioned, we'll be starting to share some overlaps and themes, one of them being around time and consideration around spaces and informal and formal knowledge bases. I'm Katherine again, the founder of Latent. We are a firm that is about, at the core, it's architecture and design, but it's providing and restoring access. It's access to space, it's access to wealth, it's shared wealth, it's access to shade, to food, and to beautiful landscapes. And ultimately, this is about social and spatial equity and justice. We look at that and use our design tools to think about this as small or as large as the context does allow. And within today, I will share a story of of a few of our projects and a story of a street in a city, which I think many people on the call and many communities experience similarities with the street. At the core, every day, this is what we think we do. This is our mission statement. Our body of work shows that we are confident enough now to take the risk to embrace that architecture is not always the answer, but our practice and process is the same around these steps of define, design, and deploy. And so I'll walk you through how we employ this process through a series of projects, starting with defining the context. And this is where you already start to see the scale of how we consider our projects. We'll start with kind of naming this one street in the city, aptly named Chicago Avenue. We have found that's a street that extends all the way from Lake Michigan and on the east of Chicago, and then extends further west to a more affluent suburb called Oak Park, and then even continues west further beyond that. Within that street of Chicago Avenue, this is where our first office location was. And over time, in the 10 years we were in that office location, we found that we had started to have a series of projects along this street. It started actually furthest west at our smallest scale work, which is a pop-up retail called Boombox. And that extended further east to our largest scale and project around North Union, which is a very different neighborhood and a much larger project. I will talk about 2 projects today. One of them will be the Boys and Girls Clubs of Chicago, and another one of them will be Laramie State Bank. The additional numbers that you see at the top are starting to think about and show what happens along that street. we're not only changing income, we're not only changing demographics, we're not only going from various, also changing project types and scales, we're also losing life. At the top is the life expectancy between Oak Park and the lake, going through the neighborhood of Oak Park at the west at 82 years, moving into Austin at 72 years, moving into West Humboldt Park at 69 years, going back up to 80 as you hit Westtown and Ukrainian Village, and ultimately getting up to 85 as we hit one of the most affluent and wealthy and white neighborhoods in Chicago around River North. This is the context that we're looking at. So when I talk about as a firm about restoring access to space, wealth, it's also about life. This is the kind of critical underlayment that we have within our city. And that doesn't come from one project-based approach. It comes from generations of disinvestment and neglect. How we move that into designing a content of a building, those are some of those insurmountable challenges that David shared at the beginning that it seems like we take on. And that's just our context of Chicago. And we have to apply that to the content of our buildings. And how we start on this first story is early fall 2019. When our mayor at the time, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, and the new Department of Planning Commissioner Maurice Cox took an initiative from the previous mayor and previous administration and rebranded it around this idea of Invest Southwest. And this was taking two pieces that I think are important to understand of how these projects developed. First, it was the expansion of a central business district and our TIF, or our tax increment financing boundary line, so that development could increase. Bigger density, higher buildings, more development can increase. Developers can pay an offset to get those density bonuses that would go into a pool of funding that would be distributed to support projects on the west and the south sides of the city that needed more financial support to close those financing gaps. So understanding that, that's an amazing citywide, enormous scale of how to think about equitable redevelopment using the tools available at the city level. We were invited to submit our qualifications for the Design Excellence Program that also launched very shortly after in the city of Chicago, and were selected as part of a team to be one of the shortlisted architects that would be qualified under design excellence projects. Within that, once that was established, we were invited to submit for an RFP for a feasibility study to imagine the tiny little square that you see on this overall, 19-20 acre site, to reimagine that space for new public use, public arts, reimagine 2 restaurants, and ultimately fit in a new community center. But yet those pieces were all yet to be determined. Could it even be possible to fit this all in? Because this site, the full site, was already designed, it was already under construction. So anyone in our really ambitious and bold planning commissioner at the time, Mr. Cox, said, well, we could always reimagine something a little bit more. So he did. Shortly after, it was Zoom everywhere all at once in 2020. And that's the context that will also overlay these 2 projects. This image is intentionally blurry because that's how it felt for many years. And I think that blur of trying to communicate, articulate project needs, build rapport and trust transformed how we went about our project process, that has elements that I think exist still within our firm and our process today. We started, the idea is just add a community center to the site. So the previous design that we picked up on that site had 2 restaurants with a drive-through, and it didn't meet the kind of urban design and design excellence criteria that the new mayor and the new commissioner had established for the city. We also had to deal with a variety of challenges within the site that was a slow conversation of setbacks, security concerns, bus depot, street changes, electricity, that moved through a series of iterations to ultimately get to an overall site plan that kept as strong as a street edge as possible along Chicago Avenue, integrated the new community center, created 2 new public plazas and opportunities for artwork, and then buried the parking towards the back of the site. Now, this is all nice and good when you see it in a flat diagram, but it was really a 2-story pile of contaminated dirt, which also speaks to the level of how our city over time, over generations, has looked at neighborhoods of color as dumping grounds. And so this pile of dirt was probably the largest component of the site, the largest cost component of the site, to take it, to remediate it, to properly dispose of it, and then finally have a working site that now we could start. So now we're looking at the site that 3 new buildings, a parking lot, a drive-through, a bus stop, public art, public space, trees are all going to be a part of. And this is where it stands today. We're looking southeast along Chicago Avenue. Moving from right to left, you see the public art piece with the public plaza and art piece and playground. You see the new Boys and Girls Clubs of Chicago facility. You see a street that leads you, a cross street that leads you into the parking that was vacated to lead you to the parking, and then the 2 restaurants with another dining plaza in between the 2 of them. And for us to work with the Boys and Girls Club, they were an organization that is well known across the country. They are committed to serving youth in Chicago and had spent years looking for a location on the west side of the city. Normally for them as an organization, they are excavating and rehabbing existing buildings, usually older schools. Schools or church buildings, which have a series of cloistered spaces. This project, with the opportunity to cohabitate with the restaurants, and then also have funding partners come forward. This is the first new club for the organization in almost 30 years. So for Chicagoans or maybe basketball fans, the last time they built a club was Michael Jordan's retirement. And now this is the second new club that they've built in the city of Chicago. What you see here is the Chicago Avenue Street facade. So you see this elongated facade that really fronts the street with an open base of clear glazing and then punched openings over 2 step floors above. You could see a little bit of the artwork to the right of the image, and on the left you see that intersection that leads you to the parking, and then the restaurants to the east. As you walk into this new building, we carved away at the corner this void of an entry to brightly light and direct everyone to that entry. As a facility that's working with youth that could be as young as 6 or as old as 21, 22, and their parents and siblings that come with them, and community events on top of that, we really started to think through a variety of issues of both visibility, transparency, lines of sight, and showcasing a bold type of architecture. We also loved a client that has a really strong brand that embraced the idea of bringing the blue of their brand into the exterior of the building. We also worked from the feasibility study to the building itself. We had these moments where we got to nudge the city back, where we were able to say, let's look at our public art program and put a notable piece of public art here, where its previous design had a flagpole with the Chicago flag. I love Chicago. Lots of people love Chicago, but really, I think this is a much better choice of art than a flag of the city. We also started to think through how this entry, when I talked about lines of sight and visibility, were coming with a client that, because they were rehabbing existing buildings that were smaller, tighter, more closed down, and thinking about, maybe dated mentalities of, what protection can be for youth and views for youth, they had a tendency to want a very closed off space. They wanted to replicate some of those fortress-like spaces and their definitions of security. So we work with them to understand that lines of sight and glazing and views in and out are safe, are peeks into how peeks into what's happening within the space, and then also allows for them to have a very flexible staffing model where one person at the front desk can see someone walking through the entry on the left, going down the hallway and to the elevator on the right, and into the gym on the far right, which we will see next. That main entry carries you is that central spine to carry you to all 3 floors, but really becomes a command center to start to think about and see people moving through the building without it starting to feel like security, surveillance, observation, like letting youth be free to do what they want, where they want within the building. And that was a visual and architectural move to talk about trust. This main gym space has has glazing on both sides, so allow for clear views to the playground beyond, and then out to the adjacent street that leads you into the parking. That brings in a lot of natural light throughout the space to allow them to keep their artificial lighting off. And then we also started to integrate items built-in items within the space itself. And like I said, they're a very branded organization. So on photo day, when we were there, this was not asked for. They are just very blue. And we were able to start to see how that thread of branding and space work together. One thing to note about this project is that you will see that this is a concrete building, and then a concrete structure for Chicago is fairly atypical. And then because we're a steel city, and within that, because of where we were positioned and when this project started at the during the front end of the pandemic, we designed and priced 2 structures, a steel structure and a concrete structure. And because of procurement delays for those long span steel structures steel trusses that would cover the gym, we ended up with a concrete structure that was slightly less expensive, could get here slightly faster because we had a very tight 13-month construction timeline for the organization to be open in time for their summer programming. That aside, we are looking from one of the corners of the first floor of the building where we have this combination teaching kitchen and cafeteria, and ultimately a big flex space that can be combined for a variety of programs as the organization grows and their programming for this specific neighborhood grows and becomes incredibly unique. One of the things with the commercial kitchen that came from a direct conversations and partnerships with the 2 adjacent restaurants who had their own internal culinary programs, training programs that they wanted to help expand to become youth training programs in the culinary arts. And that is a piece of that collaboration that could come from an inquisitive feasibility study that extends beyond a traditional kind of architecture scope. As we said, when we get to play with concrete, we'll showcase it everywhere, and we'll be able to, and when we have a client that loves their brand, we'll try and integrate it as much as possible. And if you ever have a client that tells you yes to a purple bathroom, that means you have to do it. And so we stack the program and the layers of the building, go from youngest on the first floor to oldest on the 3rd floor, and then the color wayfinding corresponds with each level. When we think about youth as not only the end citizen of the building that we're working within, we're also think very deeply of how are we showcasing their voices throughout. This isn't just, a pick and point sort of exercise. This is about a true co-design. And throughout the process, both Lisa from our team and Nick from our team really thought through how we can create moments within the architecture to bring some of the inspirational phrases that the youth created and voted on, to bring them into that entry walkway embedded into the concrete, and then bring them through construction site visits throughout the process to know this is their home, this is their space, this is a career, and this is ultimately, thinking about how we bring more women and people of color even into understanding and embracing and giving their opinion about their built environment and knowing that they could change it. And at that third floor above the gym, where we have most of the larger teen spaces, we also have this gorgeous outdoor roof deck that faces the city and gives a view to the downtown skyline. So you can feel free and dare to dream and look at a future, a different future, and have these safe spaces to think about, the programming that could happen concurrently within this building. You will also see that from an architectural standpoint, our metal profile facade, which was a stock item that was also available, which is now discontinued right after our project was done. We transitioned from the metallic metal panels of the blue into the perforated metal panels as it screens the roof deck and then ultimately all of the RTUs that are up there, but frames these unique views to the city skyline itself. Happening absolutely at the same time was the Laramie State Bank project, so just west of the site. We were just crossing over neighborhood boundaries between those two sites, and we were also driving between them for all of 2021, 22, and even 23. This is a building that was, a looming monolith on the corner of Chicago and Laramie. It was originally a pharmacy when the neighborhood was predominantly Eastern European, and it had the true American story. Immigrant family comes over, starts their own business, has a drugstore. One of the children it goes into banking and finances, starts their own bank, and they did it in 1929. So as we build this incredible monument to banking with beautiful details, to think about this absolutely unique Art Deco and Egyptian revival combination on a terracotta facade, they went out of business within the first year of opening. So now we have a bank that is already starting to morph and move, even though they were trying to portray all of these images of prosperity, of the coins with laurels, or saving for a rainy day with the squirrels. This is really a visual choose your own adventure of all the motifs on the exterior of the building. And this building, you'll see, has loomed large on the corner since that time. These are photos from on the right, 2009, where you could still see kind of the vibrancy of that terracotta. You will see that 5-foot-high parapet has been removed over time, and then the signage and uses started to morph. You could see vents coming out from food from having cafes and cafeterias. You could see really big signage, and you could see how tight to the corner that building sits as the streetscape changed and that streetscape profile changed over the decades that the bank was there. This is when you have a historic renovation and adaptive reuse project, there's always a long, lengthy history and report that comes with it. And within that, this was only how the building received its landmark designation to look at the historic banking interior. This was the one photo that was provided. It's a scan of a copy of a copy of a copy. That's it. That's what our team had to work on, is looking at a one photo interior restoration to be able to bring the building up to the former historic glory that the main double height banking hall was at. And I think it's with this, I always found it very ironic, because we have one photo that's documenting this history and this definition of preservation, right? This is a definition of preservation that's looking at the building as an object, versus all the photos we found when we started to tour the building of the parties, the histories of social life and gathering and birthdays, and even old records of when the third floor was converted into an apartment. And for us, that's starting to also frame the way that we think about preservation, and maybe an overall industry shift in how to think about preservation, from the preservations of objects and buildings to the preservations of cultures and histories. And that is what kind of drove us in this project and motivated us to bring this building back to life. Because when we found it and went into it, the very first time. It had been vacant for only maybe about, some say 8 years, some said 12 years, but the water damage that happened in that short amount of time was significant. When you walk into a building that looks like this, with the ceiling essentially, the plaster ceiling essentially on the floor, it takes your breath away in a very different way. It's not only awe, because you could see, as architects and designers, we could see the potential, we see that history, but also it's just, you know, like, man, it's 10 o'clock a.m. and I feel like we need to go get a drink, because like this is a project, this is tough, and can we actually do that? And the project, we're looking at the main baking hall that mimics the photo that I showed you, the blurry photo that I showed you earlier. And you could see where, you know, you could imagine where those tellers were, where all that plaster was, you know, how that space bustled with life, from both a banking aspect and then even from when it was an event hall and a cafeteria. You could see all the life that was there. And even if you're good on your I Spy, you should be able to see a Mylar balloon still stuck up in the plaster itself. The building was incredibly beautiful in the way that it's laid out, of thinking about these framing of the views of the terracotta facade and the columns that frame the entry. And so you get these peaks of the building from the interior as you're walking through the space. This is a project that where, you know, as I mentioned, it started at the same time. It actually started before the Boys and Girls Club project. And we are still waiting for the funding to come in to help support the design, the renovations. There have been millions of dollars already received for stabilization, and the first phase of the project, which is a 78-unit affordable housing complex, is starting next door. And we're still hopeful that this big project will continue to move forward in the next couple years. And so with that, that kind of speaks to the time that we're working on. It's the time of sometimes hope. It's the time of a rush building project. And ultimately, this is the thing of how we think about this last piece of our process, which is about deploying design, deploying architecture, deploying strategy and solutions. Many people ask me after 14 years, how did you start? What's your business plan? You know, why did you decide to do it? I got laid off in 2010, and, you know, this is my business plan, and this is no joke. It's still in my drawer next to me at my desk, and these are the 2 Post-it notes that I made the first day that I applied for my LLC at that time. One of them was a quote from an artist that said that they wanted to make the thing that makes the things. So they weren't interested in an artistic sense of making the beautiful object. They were interested in the artistic sense of making the beautiful system. And that appealed to me. I had never heard that before. I was taught to make beautiful objects in architecture school. I was never taught to make beautiful systems. The other one is your practical business advice of don't go broke. So there's always an oops to that, because architecture and firm and process and practice is always sometimes a giant oops. People also ask me how I learned to do the work that we do. And my answer is I didn't. On the left is what I was taught. In school, I was taught this set of architecture. To be an architect, you need to know concept design, schematic design, you know, bid documents. How do you answer an RFI and construction administration process and phase? You know, that's what I was taught. But really what I learned of being a practitioner is that you could be a designer, an activist, a contractor, a fixer, the corporation, sometimes a developer. And we have done all that in all the projects that you see on the street in Chicago, and then across the range of our work scope and skill. And none of that is learned in school. That is that informal learning that comes through taking the chance, the risk to take on some of these projects that, you know, don't fit neatly within these, you know, 5 traditional, you know, architectural, contractual phases of work, because the phases of work for those contracts really don't think about the decades of what social and spatial equity look like. And I say that a lot because somebody said it to me first. When we were, one of our early projects was a mobile market in a decommissioned CTA bus. So it was responding to the plague of food deserts and really food apartheid that we have in Chicago, and looked at a small scale solution to restore food access in neighborhoods that didn't have an access to a grocery store. And we presented it at that time to the core 77 awards, which some of you, it's still active, some of you might know, some of you might have won it. But we came in second, and the jury response to our project at that time was, it's a beautiful project, but it might be too socio-political. So this idea that we cared about people and place, a policy, that we rolled that into our design solution, it made it admirable, commendable, well designed. But because it had too much of that activist tone, like that didn't make it like the top prize worthy. And I think to myself, and I always put this in my presentations because that's still what motivates me, because it allowed me to understand the language that people were seeing our work in a new light. It made me it had to challenge if that was the work we wanted to continue to do. And it was a moment where I think even within architecture, we had to decide, are we thinking about the beautiful object, or are we thinking about the beautiful system? And that is what our work is thinking about that scale of systems as large as a system or as small as an object. And those are the pieces that make up the growth and the development and the design of a street in a city. So thank you.
Thank you. That was incredible. And Zoe, I presume we just go segue right into questions now. I'll assume silence means yes. You guys can hear me okay? Yeah. Well, I've prepared some questions, and they're some of them are more tailored to you, David, Katherine, others are more tailored to you, but they both, I think, have some overlap. So I'll start by asking a question that's slightly more tailored towards David, but then actually, Katherine, it might be applicable to your work at Latent as well. Is that you're both quite explicitly and wonderfully process-oriented practices. And in a process-oriented practice, there's inevitably experimentation. And with experimentation, there's also inevitably failure. Me and our office makes mistakes all the time. And so how we handle them is like an interesting thing to us. So I guess my question is, how do you deal with failure? And I guess more specifically, or when maybe failure is too strong of a word. How do you navigate it when something goes the way that you didn't anticipate? And I guess, David, your documentation is so rigorous, and I admire it so much. One like sub question within that previous question is, does the rigor of your documentation of your processes allow you to adapt and to evolve, and do you find it like useful in that regard? So maybe I'll lob it at you first, David, and then Katherine, perhaps some of the projects you're working on have so many partners that I imagine that there's navigating like that nebulous road may also be applicable to you as well. So David?
Yeah, I'll take a pass at failure is not too strong of a word. We face that often, too often, and we find ourselves quite frustrated by things that we thought would work well, and then they don't. And working with living systems is incredibly difficult in that way. And I do find a lot of solace, and I think I really do admire the posture and the perspective of gardeners when they talk about failures, or when they try different experiments and they don't turn out as they planned. And I think what we want to happen is that our failures are fairly small and seen in context of a lot of larger successes, like a gardener trying out one new plant in a collection of 30 plants. that the failure seems, the experiment feels able to fail without losing a lot more than anticipated. Unfortunately, we've had failures that were much larger than that. And the proportion might have been shifted, might be the opposite, where one of the 30 plants do well and the rest don't. And that's something that we faced. That's one of the frustrations of the installation focused practice, is that there's a few projects that have not done well over time for various reasons. Some reasons because of the management techniques or the management strategies, some because of oversights on I don't want to pretend like we knew it all and it's someone else's fault. Sometimes we just got something wrong, and we have to kind of step up to the plate on that one. But that's one thing that we like about, I think the older our practice is getting, the more we want to be observing the projects. And that's one of the primary motivations behind taking photos and doing drawings of these projects after the installation has completed, just so that we could get a sense of how things are going and we can have a continued dialogue. I think one of the worst situations in our office has been we haven't kept in contact with the projects, and then a few years down the road, after decisions have been made, then we discover some pretty embarrassing failures. One of the benefits of working with the university is that we've been able to find funding in other places and not depend on funding at the source, at the kind of owner level, so that we can try to understand this failure, try to draft a grant proposal that says, how do we understand this more closely, and how do we revisit this situation?
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now I'm gonna go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, I could answer it briefly. So of course, ditto to everything David said. But I think one of the places when I think about this question of failure is that I feel that we're often our project starting point is starting from a point of failure. Our cities have failed a lot of people, in terms of investment, in terms of equity, in terms of development, in terms of access. So we're starting from points where that's already done. And then how do we build that back up? And I think within that has come a perspective to, for us, one of our biggest questions starts to be, how did you feel comfortable taking the risk to expand beyond architecture and be a developer, or have a GC license, or think about projects in this way? And part of that is not being afraid of failing, because it's inevitable in some ways. We think about, there's the failure of, maybe this process could have been better. Is that a failure? Is that really a critical examination? Did we have a bad article? Is that a failure or another opportunity to say, like, how was our messaging around that? Is the building failing? No, but is it being used in a way that maybe we didn't anticipate 5 years ago, 10 or 14 years ago now? Those are things that I think we're willing to embrace, that risk level that allows us to expand better, because we're not afraid of failure. Or myself personally, it's going to happen, and we have to think about being able to take the risk to imagine a different future, especially when we're working in neighborhoods where people do at times feel that the city has failed them over the course of their life there, or whether it's generations and 50, 60 years in a neighborhood, or even, only 16, 17 years within a neighborhood, and some of our young people that we work with.
Well, I think that I so appreciate, Catherine, what you were saying about how, though you are designing and making buildings, that you're also designing systems. And I think that within that framework, it gives you room to navigate things that might go less ideal than you would imagine. I'm going to ask one more question, slightly more tailored to you, Catherine. And then there's a few questions in the Q&A that I'll jump to, because I just want to be watching the time as well. In it seems that part of what you do as a designer or your team at Latent does is you try to incorporate a lot of diverse voices of the community, but also it seems like you have a lot of projects where you have multiple clients, like, and so you guys are at the confluence of all this information, and that's important. But I guess my question is, how do you begin to negotiate between differing opinions within like the various facets of the stakeholders or multiple clients you might have on a project, as well as the public? How do you filter this information? And then how do you, as like a design office, insert your design voice like within that tornado of information? I guess it's a question of how do you absorb everything? And we have to be sponges sometimes, but then also how do you navigate the creation of an architectural idea? Or how do you parse those things out?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I hope I'll be succinct in my answer. I think
You
productive
can
tension.
ramble. I
Okay,
ramble all the time.
I can do that too. Uh, I think productive tensions are good, right? And I think this is when, as our teams grew and as our stakeholders grew, and this is what I think specifically came with more public and municipal projects that have a deeper team, like that bureaucracy operates very differently. When you partner with bureaucracy and when you partner with community, they have different ways of communicating. So I think we learned how to bring some of those productive tensions and conversations to light, navigate and facilitate them well, and then understand what the underlying intent or concern was, and then making people feel comfortable that no is a perfectly acceptable answer to some things, but no, but why? And I think that's where we frame it on things. We have no but whys. Everyone does on every project. Sometimes it's the no but why is budget. Sometimes the no but why is it's too big of an idea. Sometimes it's not the right time. So if you have that underlying understanding, I think that's where we work as good facilitators to bring about consensus, design consensus and solution. I do know there's moments where we also had to learn over time, and even myself, to speak with more authority from a position of both authority and embrace my own power, both as a designer and a woman of color working in Chicago. As you just get older, working in a field, you just get older, but that's more experience. So it's more experience with my city, with my neighborhoods, and then also with the field of architecture to lean into that expertise. Because I started my firm when I was 27, so that's very green, that's very naive, but it's also very bold and kind of like full of hubris and energy that you go about, bashing your head into things, and that's fun. But when you start to have that experience of 14 years under your belt, how do you recalibrate what power looks like? Power sometimes when you're looks like energy, right? And to move through a lot of variations, but power when you have it and get to build on really deep knowledge, responds and has different responses.
Cool. Thank you. David, I'm sure that you deal with that as well.
Follow that. That was beautiful. No.
Productive tension though, nice. I'm gonna steal that. That's a great turn. I like that. Oh, David, you're good. Nothing. Okay. I'm gonna go to the Q&A. And a question, I'll start with one for David, and then there's actually a couple for Katherine as well. David from Felipe Palacios. David, fascinating work in expanding the scope of landscape architecture. How would you recommend to engage a project that is, quote, already finished and you cannot further control in the future? Do you think that the general public is starting to appreciate the wild aesthetics of your completed projects?
Hello, Felipe, fantastic designer down in Quito.
Oh, you know Felipe.
Felipe is wonderful. Yes.
Cool.
But the question was,
you didn't set this up, did you? No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. No, it would have been much easier than that, I think, if I'd have set this up. So about the question about the wild, I don't see a lot of the wild is something that we're trying to make a case for, and we have to make a case very carefully in our context, right? There's a lot of cultural associations with vacant land and disinvestment when it comes to wild planting. And we have to be very careful not to bring that those associations to our projects. And so I think the wild is something that we engage very carefully, but we have to do it at a scale and with detail that really clarifies and demonstrates intent. And we also work very diligently to make a case for more ecologically diverse and more diverse types of planting. So we're in the Southeast. Southern Living has loomed large in our region. Southern Living as the magazine where there's a consistent language of how landscapes have been seen as healthy and productive and wealthy. And so those productive land, those images of landscape are quite overused and stale. And so we have to constantly be making a case for why an alternative to that look, because that is consistently a default, and it's seen as value and beneficial. And so our case is at multiple levels. We make a case with people about ecological benefit. We make a case about hydrological benefit, lower maintenance. All of those cases start to build up possibilities for other types of landscapes. But ultimately, we really value the kind of case about engaging imagination and engaging other possibilities, so that we have a series of landscapes that are really filled with wonder and curiosity and awe, and people can see processes. I really appreciate that you said that we're a process-oriented firm. That's something that we hold very dear, and we want to expose people that we work with and the general public with processes so that they can start to build that understanding and language and that relationship.
It's hard to figure out how to thoughtfully overthrow these problematically entrenched cultures. You know what I mean? Because it requires patience and impatience. Like our office, sometimes I feel like we live in this little bubble and we're all this positive ecological gardening and change is happening. And then the other day I go to a neighborhood 25 minutes away from the office that I've never been to, and it's just an oceans of like your typical lawns and foundation planting, and it's just like, and then you just realize anyways, I think we all in our various ways like fight these different battles. But thanks, David. Katherine, there's a question for you, and it's actually kind of a more technical question, but I actually think stuff like this is super important. It's from Gordon Skinner, and Gordon is asking, Katherine, is Latent a minority and women business enterprise, certified vendor, providing and responding to RFP/bids from municipalities? What have you learned? What was anticipated? What hasn't been? And what has led to mutually beneficial experiences for Latent and your clients in this realm?
Thanks, Gordon, for that question. And I think it's really interesting because I in my youth of starting the firm, I was very adamant that I didn't want to be hired because I was a woman or a checkbox, or because I was Black, or because I was Hispanic. I didn't want to be hired because of those set-asides that exist on many projects that happen within Chicago. Is like I wanted to be hired for who we were, what our process was, and what our design was. And so I never got any certifications for probably the first maybe 6-7 years or so. And it took several rounds of business mentors and even partners who I enjoyed collaborating with, saying, we understand where you're coming from. You don't want to be the diversity hire, but you bring so much value to projects that you're actually not getting a chance to showcase, because that is also how our municipal projects works. We have very strong set-asides. We have very strong teaming requirements in Chicago. So we can't make space for you because we want to have you here, but we also, there's benefits to that. So I had to have kind of my own internal discussion on what do I want to do in that situation, and then move forward with getting all the certifications. So minority, women, and disadvantaged, business enterprise. And then once you do one, then you stack them up between the city, the state, and the federal level. Because they all end up, reusing similar information. Within that realm, that did open up a lot of doors for some of the larger projects that you see. So I understood a level of how the city operates after that process, which was, kind of opaque to myself. That's even thinking about when we talk about access, there was a lot of in that process around access to projects, to design, to funding, that we learned, and then I've shared with other firms and have encouraged them to go, who might feel the same way, like, go get your certifications. This is how it helped us, because we were able then to be on this team, maybe as a sub, but as we grew in our expertise, we're leading teams now. All the projects that we are ones that we led, right? So we don't need to team. And that's something that now we've been able to grow into and have set ourselves apart as a firm, that we're a design first firm. We can, even with our smaller team as a more of a boutique size, we could still lead projects, and now looking at when we're building teams. We just submitted for a proposal where it's 100% women and minority owned businesses. So we're saying, like, yeah, sure, you have your standards, but we're going to surpass that. We're going to show you all the great work and businesses, designers, engineers that are in Chicago that are also just not getting the same exposure. And we're going to build our own team, and it's going to knock your socks off, right? So that's how we've started to shift that. It has, because of the increased work from municipal projects, which I think is at least a third of our work, we have had to kind of restructure what it means within our small business, from a business and a financial and an administrative side. Like, holy shit, do they have a lot of paperwork that seems unnecessary, So like, how do we even think about that? How do we also start to think about where there's so much rhetoric around, we want to support small businesses of color, but then they put us on like 120-day payment schedule? Like, how do you actually restructure your firm to start to think through that? So those technical, firm and process and practice questions become directly related to what happens when you do decide to pursue this work, because we are very invested in community-based work. Some of that community-based work is either coming out of, departments and municipalities, but it also might have funding structures that require a certain set of, team and demographic requirements that also make us build teams in certain ways. So we've had to look at all of those finance and municipal and departmental structures, from approvals, closing, payments, and have to fold that into how we operate as a firm, but then also what our design and strategy recommendations are to our clients that we work with.
Thank you for sharing that. That's an awesome answer. It's impossible and fascinating. To speak like our office, for example, recently, we aspire to, as a team, to do work that is more public facing, but the ecosystem of projects of that scale almost requires that we become an office with a marketing department, and you know what I mean, and all these things that we don't want to be. And so it's like this perplexing problem of how to engage with a system that, these bureaucracies that like require you to change as a business, that then may make you change as a business.
It is. And I think one thing that we've learned as a staff, and what I kind of encourage anyone on our team who is working on with a public department or a public facing project in that manner, is that if you embrace bureaucracy, you could understand so much of how your city works and where there's other gaps and failures, and you could use it to your project advantage on a project. So that's sometimes the specificity of language and a request, that sometimes the maneuvering of different pieces of funding, how we got public art on Boys and Girls Club was saying, we have this fund, there is a money there, let's reallocate it towards a specific project. So those are the nuances that I think started to help us as we understood it further.
Well, thank you for the pep talk. I think there could be a whole Zoom that's just like a therapy session, group therapy on navigating bureaucracy as small business owners. Oh my God. Well, this has been lovely. I think we're like due on time. Anne has reappeared, which makes me think I've curated this well, I hope. But Katherine, thank you so much. It was so great to meet you and to hear more about your work. And David, likewise. I hope it feels to me like it was a really interesting pairing. You guys have such similarities and such differences. So you're lovely foils to each other. Oh, you're muted, Anne.
The saying of the last 4 years, you were muted. I want to add my thanks. I think that it was just truly striking to see the beauty inherent in ecologically, socially, and financially, both responsive and responsible form. What would seem like pragmatic solutions required so much underpinning, both, technically, economically, and philosophically. And it was just beautiful. Please join us next week, same time, same non-place, where we'll see work from Aduo and Studio Ala, one based in New York City and the other in Guadalajara. So very different work. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for those just really beautiful presentations and your words, David.